It was a warm, sunny afternoon in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The streets were lined with trees, and children could be heard laughing as they played in their yards. Among them was Amara, a 9-year-old girl with a bright smile and curious eyes. She wore her favorite blue dress and had her hair styled in neat braids. Amara loved being outside, and today she was happily drawing chalk pictures on the sidewalk in front of her house. Her artwork depicted colorful flowers and a big sun, radiating the innocence and creativity of childhood. Nearby, an older neighbor, Mr. Thompson, sat on his porch reading a newspaper. He had lived in the neighborhood for decades and often kept an eye on the kids playing. Amara's joyful presence always brought a smile to his face, but the peace of the afternoon was soon disrupted by an unexpected arrival. A patrol car slowly drove down the street and stopped in front of Amara's house. Officer James Carter, a tall, stern-looking cop in his late 40s, stepped out. He adjusted his belt and scanned the area with a serious expression. Carter had been called to the scene after someone reported suspicious activity. He approached Amara, who looked up at him curiously, her chalk still in hand. "Hey there, young lady," Officer Carter said, his voice firm. "What are you doing here?" Amara, confused but polite, replied, "I'm drawing pictures for my mommy. She likes flowers." Carter frowned, glancing at the chalk drawings on the sidewalk. "We got a call about someone causing trouble in this area. Are you supposed to be out here?" Amara tilted her head. "Yes, sir. I'm just playing in front of my house. I live here." Before she could say more, Carter's tone became more assertive. "Well, I'm going to need you to come with me. Let's go." The little girl's eyes widened in shock. "But I didn't do anything wrong," she exclaimed, her voice trembling. She looked toward Mr. Thompson, who had now put down his newspaper and stood up, watching the situation unfold with concern. Ignoring her protests, Officer Carter grabbed her wrist and placed handcuffs on her small hands. The cuffs were far too big for her, and tears welled up in her eyes. "You're coming with me until we figure this out," he said, leading her toward the patrol car. By now, other neighbors had noticed the commotion. Mrs. Rodriguez, a kind woman who lived 2 houses down, rushed over, disbelief written all over her face. "What are you doing? She's just a child," she exclaimed, her voice rising in anger. "You can't arrest her." "She's being detained for questioning," Carter replied curtly. "Step back, Mom." Amara's cries grew louder as she was placed in the back seat of the car. Her tiny frame looked out of place in the cold, metallic confines of the vehicle. The neighbors stood frozen, unsure of what to do, but their shock quickly turned into action. Phones came out, and several people began recording the scene. They couldn't believe what they were witnessing. As Carter closed the car door, Amara's sobs echoed through the quiet street. Mr. Thompson and Mrs. Rodriguez exchanged worried glances, silently agreeing that this was far from over. The neighborhood, once peaceful and cheerful, now felt heavy with tension and disbelief. What had just happened was wrong, and they knew they had to stand up for Amara. Little did Officer Carter know, his actions were about to spark a chain of events that would change everything. The quiet neighborhood was no longer the peaceful haven it had been just minutes ago. Amara's cries from the back seat of the patrol car had drawn neighbors out of their homes. People stood on their lawns and porches, watching in disbelief as Officer Carter, a seasoned policeman, sat in the driver's seat with a 9-year-old girl handcuffed behind him. Her small, tear-streaked face pressed against the window, and it was a sight that no one in the community could ignore. Mrs. Rodriguez, a middle-aged woman known for her kindness and protective nature, was the first to act. She rushed over to the patrol car, her voice shaking with anger and concern. "Officer, what are you doing? That's just a little girl. She hasn't done anything wrong." "She's being detained for questioning," Officer Carter replied coldly, avoiding eye contact with her. "Please step back, ma'am." But Mrs. Rodriguez wasn't about to back down. "Questioning? About what? She's 9 years old. She's playing with chalk in front of her own house. How is that a crime?" Her words seemed to wake the other neighbors, who started gathering closer to the patrol car. Among them was Mr. Thompson, the retired teacher who had been watching Amara from his porch. He shook his head as he approached, his calm but firm voice cutting through the tension. "Officer, you're making a mistake. I've been sitting here all afternoon. That girl hasn't done anything but draw flowers on the sidewalk." Carter glanced at the growing crowd and tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "I'm just doing my job," he said defensively. "I got a call about suspicious activity, and I'm investigating it." Suspicious activity. Another neighbor called out incredulously. "She's a kid with chalk. What's suspicious about that?" The murmurs of disapproval grew louder, and several neighbors began pulling out their phones to record the scene. "This isn't right," someone muttered. "You can't treat a child like this." Amara's cries softened into quiet sniffles as she watched the neighbors argue on her behalf. She felt scared but also comforted by their presence. She pressed her small hands against the glass, her big eyes searching for her mom, wishing she would come and make everything okay. Meanwhile, Mrs. Rodriguez wasn't done. She stepped closer to the car and raised her phone, recording as she spoke. "Officer, I'm filming this. You have no right to arrest this child. You're going to have to explain yourself, not just to us, but to the entire world." Her words seemed to rattle Carter, but he didn't respond. Instead, he radioed for backup, hoping the growing crowd would disperse once more officers arrived. In the meantime, Malik, Amara's 22-year-old brother, arrived on the scene. He had been in the backyard working on his law school homework when he heard the commotion. Seeing his little sister in the back of a police car made his heart drop. He rushed toward Mrs. Rodriguez and Mr. Thompson, his voice shaking with controlled anger. "What's going on? Why is my sister in handcuffs?" Mrs. Rodriguez quickly filled him in. Malik's face hardened as he turned to the officer. "Sir, this is wrong. My sister hasn't done anything illegal. You can't just detain her without cause." Officer Carter looked up at Malik, his defensive posture stiffening. "This is an official matter. Please step back." Malik, who had been studying constitutional law, took a deep breath to calm himself. "Officer, with all due respect, you are violating her rights. She's a minor, and she hasn't been read her rights or given a reason for her detention. This is unlawful." The neighbors murmured in agreement, and the tension in the air grew thicker. Some began calling Amara's mother, Tanya, who had been at the grocery store, urging her to come home immediately. As the crowd continued to grow and Malik pressed the officer for answers, Officer Carter began to realize he had underestimated the community's unity and determination. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. The people here weren't going to let him get away with treating a child unfairly. The situation was spiraling out of control, and little did he know, karma was about to hit harder than he ever expected. The situation in the neighborhood was becoming more intense by the minute. A crowd of concerned neighbors surrounded the patrol car, their voices growing louder as they demanded answers from Officer Carter. Despite the chaos, Amara sat quietly in the backseat, her tear-streaked face pressed against the window. Her little hands, still in oversized handcuffs, trembled as she watched the people she knew rally around her. She wanted to feel safe, but the fear inside her was overwhelming. Just then, the sound of hurried footsteps broke through the noise. Tanya, Amara's mother, came running down the street, her grocery bags abandoned on the sidewalk as soon as she got the call. Her heart was pounding, her mind racing with questions. What could have possibly happened to her baby girl? And why was there talk of her being arrested? As soon as Tanya saw the patrol car and her daughter inside, her panic turned into a mix of anger and disbelief. She pushed through the crowd, her voice trembling with emotion. "Amara, baby, are you okay?" she called out. Amara's eyes lit up with relief at the sight of her mom. "Mommy," she cried, her voice muffled through the window. "I didn't do anything. I was just drawing." Tanya turned to Officer Carter, her face full of determination. "Why is my daughter in that car? She's 9 years old. What could she have possibly done to deserve this?" Officer Carter, trying to maintain his authority, responded curtly, "Ma'am, please calm down. Your daughter was acting suspiciously, and I'm handling the situation." "Suspiciously," Tanya repeated, her voice rising. "You call drawing flowers on the sidewalk suspicious? She's a child, for heaven's sake." Before Carter could respond, Malik, Tanya's eldest son, stepped forward. He had been trying to gather more information from the neighbors when he saw his mom arrive. A 22-year-old law student with a calm but commanding presence, Malik knew he had to handle the situation carefully but firmly. "Officer," Malik said, his tone steady but resolute, "as her legal guardian, my mother deserves a clear explanation for why my sister is being detained. And as a law student, I can tell you right now that this looks like an unlawful detention." Carter bristled at the challenge, but didn't respond immediately. The growing crowd murmured in agreement, emboldened by Malik's confidence. Tanya stepped closer to the patrol car, her hands trembling as she tried to comfort Amara through the glass. "It's okay, baby. Mommy's here. We'll get you out." Malik continued, "Officer, the Fourth Amendment protects individuals from unreasonable searches and seizures. You've provided no evidence of a crime, no cause for detention, and no explanation for why a minor is in handcuffs. I strongly suggest you release her immediately." Carter's face tightened. He was beginning to realize that this wasn't going to be as straightforward as he had thought. The community wasn't backing down, and now he had to deal with a mother's fury and a law student's knowledge of the legal system. Just as the situation reached a boiling point, a familiar voice joined the crowd. It was Mrs. Rodriguez, holding up her phone. "I've recorded everything, officer. You've got the entire neighborhood as witnesses. If you don't release that child, this video is going straight to the local news and the department." The weight of the moment hung heavily in the air. Carter hesitated, glancing between the crowd, the mother pleading for her daughter, and the young man standing tall with legal facts on his side. He felt the pressure mounting and the realization that this could spiral into something much bigger than he had anticipated. Amara watched her family and neighbors with a mix of hope and fear. She didn't understand everything that was happening, but seeing her mother and brother fight for her made her feel a little less alone. Tanya and Malik stood their ground, determined to protect her no matter what. As Carter tried to figure out his next move, backup arrived in the form of another patrol car. But this wasn't the kind of support he was hoping for. Instead of diffusing the tension, the arrival of more officers only amplified the community's determination to stand up for what was right. Little did Carter know, the tables were about to turn in a way he never expected. The air was thick with tension as the second patrol car pulled up to the scene. Two officers stepped out, surveying the crowd that had now grown even larger. The neighbors' murmurs grew louder, and a wave of determination seemed to ripple through the gathering. Everyone knew this was no longer just about Amara. It was about standing up for what was right. Officer Carter looked relieved to see his colleagues, but his relief was short-lived. One of the arriving officers, Sergeant Alina Harris, was a respected figure in the department. Known for her fair and level-headed approach, she immediately noticed the uneasy energy in the crowd. Her sharp eyes took in the tearful 9-year-old girl in the back of the patrol car, the distraught mother, and the law student standing protectively beside her. "Carter," Sergeant Harris called out, walking toward him. "What's going on here?" Carter straightened his posture, trying to assert control. "We received a report of suspicious activity, and I detained the suspect for questioning." "Suspect," Harris repeated, raising an eyebrow. She turned her gaze toward Amara, her expression softening. "Are you telling me this child is the suspect?" "Yes," Carter replied stiffly. "She was drawing on the sidewalk, and the caller claimed it looked suspicious." Harris sighed deeply, her disappointment evident. "You handcuffed a child for drawing on the sidewalk. Did you even try to talk to her or her family before escalating this?" Carter hesitated, realizing that his explanation was not sitting well with Harris. "I was just following protocol," he said defensively. "Protocol," Harris said, her voice firm but calm. "Carter, we're here to protect and serve, not intimidate children. This is not how we handle situations like this." The crowd, overhearing the exchange, began to cheer quietly. Mrs. Rodriguez, still holding her phone, said loudly, "Thank you, Sergeant. Someone here has some sense." Tanya, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and frustration, stepped forward. "Sergeant, my daughter hasn't done anything wrong. She's 9 years old. She was just drawing pictures in front of our house." Harris nodded, listening carefully. She then turned to Carter. "Release her. Now." Carter looked stunned. "But," "I said, release her," Harris repeated firmly. "This has already gone too far." With the eyes of the community, his colleagues, and Harris on him, Carter had no choice but to comply. He reluctantly opened the car door and removed the handcuffs from Amara's tiny wrists. As soon as she was free, Amara jumped into her mother's arms, sobbing softly. Tanya hugged her tightly, whispering, "It's okay, baby. Mommy's got you." The crowd erupted in applause, cheering for the family and Sergeant Harris. Malik stepped forward, his voice steady but resolute. "Sergeant, I appreciate you stepping in, but this incident isn't over. My sister deserves an apology, and I expect this to be addressed formally." Harris nodded. "You're absolutely right, and I'll make sure this is reported. Carter's actions will be reviewed, and I'll personally follow up with your family." Turning back to the crowd, Harris raised her hands to calm them. "I understand your frustration, and I thank you for standing up for what's right. But I assure you, this matter will be handled properly." The community's energy shifted from anger to cautious optimism. Neighbors who had been strangers before this moment now felt united by their shared resolve to protect one of their own. Carter, meanwhile, stood silently, his face flushed with embarrassment. The weight of his actions was beginning to sink in. He had underestimated the power of a tight-knit community and the leadership of someone like Sergeant Harris. As the crowd began to disperse, Amara looked up at her brother. "Malik, is it over?" Malik knelt down to her level, his voice gentle. "Not yet, little sis. But don't worry. We'll make sure this never happens to you or anyone else again." The tables had truly turned. What had started as an unfair and unjust act against a child had become a moment of unity and accountability. And while the battle wasn't over, the first step toward justice had been taken. As the crowd slowly dispersed, the tension lingering in the air shifted to a mix of relief and determination. Amara was finally free, held tightly in her mother's arms, her small frame trembling as she clung to the safety she felt with her family. Neighbors, still shaken by what they had witnessed, lingered nearby, quietly talking among themselves. They were relieved the situation had de-escalated, but many couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger needed to happen. Sergeant Alina Harris stayed back to ensure that everything was resolved properly. She could see the anger and frustration in Tanya's eyes, and the quiet resolve in Malik's. Harris approached the family with a calm but serious expression. "I want you to know I'm going to file an official report about what happened here," she said. "This was unacceptable, and it will be addressed." Tanya, still holding Amara close, looked up at Harris. "Thank you for stepping in, Sergeant. But what happens now? My daughter didn't deserve this. No child does." Harris nodded solemnly. "I understand, and I promise you, this isn't over. Officer Carter's actions will be investigated, and I'll ensure that your family is updated every step of the way." Meanwhile, Officer Carter stood a short distance away, visibly uncomfortable. His usual air of authority had vanished, replaced by a sense of unease. He had never faced a situation like this before. A crowd of angry neighbors, a firm reprimand from his superior, and the realization that his actions had been recorded on multiple phones. The weight of his decisions was beginning to hit him, and for the first time, he felt the sting of accountability. As Carter returned to his patrol car, his radio crackled to life. The station was already abuzz with reports of the incident. Word had spread quickly, and higher-ups were demanding an immediate explanation. Carter's stomach churned as he realized that his decision to detain a 9-year-old girl had escalated far beyond what he anticipated. Back in the neighborhood, Malik wasn't done. He stepped away briefly to make a phone call. As a law student, he knew exactly who to contact to bring more attention to the situation. He reached out to a local civil rights attorney, explaining what had happened in detail. The attorney, known for her dedication to fighting injustices, assured Malik she would take on the case and ensure the family's voice was heard. Meanwhile, neighbors like Mrs. Rodriguez and Mr. Thompson took to social media, sharing the videos they had captured of the incident. Within hours, the footage began to spread, gaining attention from local news outlets. The hashtags #JusticeForAmara and #ProtectOurChildren started trending, with thousands of people expressing their outrage over what had happened. Carter's discomfort grew as he realized the gravity of his actions. By the time he returned to the station, the videos had already reached his supervisors. He was called into an emergency meeting, where he was confronted with the footage and the growing public backlash. For the first time, Carter was forced to explain his actions, and the words sounded weak even to his own ears. "I was just following protocol," he said, though he knew it was a hollow defense. At the same time, Tanya and Malik were meeting with the civil rights attorney, who assured them that they had a strong case. "This isn't just about Amara," the attorney said. "It's about making sure no other child is ever treated like this again. We're going to hold the department accountable." Amara, still shaken but feeling a little more at ease with her family by her side, listened quietly as her brother and mother spoke with the attorney. Though she didn't fully understand everything, she felt comforted knowing that so many people cared about what had happened to her. As night fell over the neighborhood, the events of the day were far from over. The community's unity had sparked a movement, and karma was beginning to catch up with Officer Carter. What had started as a single unjust act was now shining a light on broader issues, forcing the department and the public to confront the need for change. For Carter, it was the beginning of a reckoning he hadn't anticipated. For Amara and her family, it was the start of a fight for justice that would resonate far beyond their small neighborhood. By the next morning, the incident in the small suburban neighborhood had become a national story. Videos of Amara's arrest, taken by concerned neighbors, had gone viral. News outlets picked up the footage, airing segments that questioned how a 9-year-old girl could be handcuffed and detained for drawing with chalk outside her own home. Social media was ablaze with outrage. People from all over the country shared their thoughts, using hashtags like #JusticeForAmara and #ProtectOurChildren to demand accountability. Tanya woke up to find her phone flooded with messages. Friends, family, and even strangers were reaching out to offer their support. She scrolled through her notifications, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of people rallying behind her daughter. While it was heartening to see so many standing up for Amara, Tanya couldn't help but feel the weight of what had happened. "This isn't just about us," she thought. "This is about making sure no other child goes through this." Malik, ever the strategist, had spent the night working with their attorney, gathering statements from neighbors, and compiling all the video evidence. The attorney was relentless, reaching out to local government officials and police accountability organizations. "We're going to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug," she assured Tanya and Malik during a morning meeting. "This case has the potential to create real change." Meanwhile, Officer Carter's world was beginning to crumble. At the police station, his actions were under intense scrutiny. His supervisors were livid, not only because of the incident itself, but also because of the massive public backlash it had caused. Carter was placed on administrative leave pending a formal investigation, a decision that was immediately announced to the media. Despite being off duty, Carter couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. Protesters gathered outside the station, holding signs that read, "Kids deserve protection, not arrests," and "Justice for Amara." The sight of the growing crowd made Carter realize just how deeply his actions had affected the community and beyond. Back in the neighborhood, the community's unity continued to grow. Mrs. Rodriguez and other neighbors organized a block meeting, inviting local activists and community leaders to discuss how they could push for better policing practices. The meeting was held at Mr. Thompson's house, where people shared their stories and brainstormed solutions. "This isn't just about what happened to Amara," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "It's about making sure every child feels safe in their own neighborhood." Amara, still shaken but slowly regaining her confidence, sat with her mother and brother as they attended the meeting. She clutched a new box of chalk that a kind neighbor had given her, a small but meaningful gesture. When someone asked her how she was feeling, she quietly said, "I just want to draw again without being scared." Her words struck a chord with everyone in the room. Malik, who had been listening intently, stood up and addressed the group. "This is about more than my sister," he said. "This is about building a community where kids can be kids and where families don't have to live in fear of being treated unfairly. We need change, and we need it now." As the day went on, support for Amara's family continued to pour in. Local businesses offered to donate supplies for community events, while activists reached out to help organize a peaceful protest. The momentum was growing, and it was clear that this was no longer just a neighborhood issue. It was becoming a movement. For Tanya, the support was both overwhelming and empowering. She watched as her neighbors, strangers, and even public figures came together to stand up for her daughter. It gave her hope that something good could come out of such a painful experience. As the sun set, Amara sat on her front porch with Malik, quietly drawing with her new chalk. She sketched a large heart surrounded by flowers, a picture of resilience and innocence. Malik smiled at her and said, "You're so brave, Amara. Don't ever forget that." While the family knew there was still a long road ahead, they also knew they weren't alone. The ripple effect of the incident was growing stronger, and it was clear that Officer Carter's actions had set off a chain of events he could never have anticipated. Karma had begun to strike, not just for him, but for the entire system that allowed such injustices to happen. The fight for justice was far from over, but the community's determination ensured that change was on the horizon. The following week marked a turning point for Amara, her family, and the entire community. The story of her wrongful detention had gained national attention, and people from all walks of life had come together to demand justice. The peaceful protest organized by the neighbors grew larger than anyone had anticipated, with hundreds of people showing up to support Amara and call for accountability. Tanya stood at the front of the crowd, holding Amara's hand tightly. Malik stood beside her, holding a sign that read, "Protect our children." The family had become a symbol of resilience, and their courage inspired many to join the cause. Local leaders, activists, and even a few politicians attended the rally, promising to push for reforms in policing practices. Amara, still shy from all the attention, clung to her mother as speakers took turns addressing the crowd. Malik gave a heartfelt speech, thanking the community for their support and calling for systemic change. "What happened to my sister could happen to anyone's child," he said. "We need to hold people accountable, but we also need to work together to build a safer, more just future for everyone." The crowd cheered in agreement, their voices echoing through the neighborhood. Amara smiled for the first time in days, feeling the warmth of the community around her. She didn't fully understand the significance of what was happening, but she knew that she wasn't alone. Meanwhile, Officer Carter faced the consequences of his actions. The department's internal investigation concluded that his decision to handcuff and detain Amara was not only unnecessary, but also a violation of protocol. He was formally disciplined and placed on extended leave, with a recommendation for additional training in handling situations involving children. The department, feeling the weight of public scrutiny, also announced new measures to prevent similar incidents in the future. They introduced mandatory de-escalation training for all officers and created a community advisory board to improve relationships between law enforcement and residents. While these changes were a step in the right direction, Tanya and Malik knew that the fight for justice didn't end there. The civil rights attorney working with the family filed a formal complaint against the department and pushed for greater accountability. The case drew attention from legal experts and advocacy groups, who pledged their support to ensure that the system would change for the better. Amara, despite her young age, became a quiet symbol of resilience. Her story inspired conversations about how children should be treated and the importance of standing up against injustice. A local artist even painted a mural in her honor, depicting her holding a piece of chalk, surrounded by colorful flowers and hearts. The mural became a powerful reminder of the strength of a community united for a cause. One evening, as the family sat on their porch, Amara looked up at her mom and asked, "Mommy, can I draw again tomorrow?" Tanya smiled, her eyes filling with tears of pride. "Of course, baby. You can draw as much as you want, and you'll never have to be scared again." Malik chimed in, his voice warm and encouraging. "You're brave, Amara. What you went through wasn't fair, but you showed everyone how strong you are. And because of you, things are going to change." Amara beamed, holding up a box of chalk that had been gifted to her by a kind neighbor. She chose a piece of pink chalk and started sketching a heart on the porch floor. This time, she didn't feel fear, only hope. The neighborhood had changed too. People who had once been strangers were now closer than ever, bonded by the shared determination to protect their community. Meetings continued, with plans to improve safety and build stronger connections between residents and law enforcement. The incident had sparked something powerful, a movement for justice and unity that showed no signs of fading. As the sun set that evening, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood, Tanya looked at her children and felt a sense of peace. What had started as a terrifying ordeal had turned into an opportunity for growth and change. Amara's innocence and bravery had ignited a spark that lit up the entire community. In the end, justice wasn't just about holding Officer Carter accountable, it was about building a better future. And for Amara, it meant she could draw her flowers and hearts in peace, surrounded by a community that would always have her back.